So when Cyclone Idai hit Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, my colleague Belinda, who most of you have been talking to, challenged me and the center and said, should we do something about it? In response, I turned to one of the people in the region that has been working with us on many projects, Grasa Machel, to see if we could frame a discussion around this. And the result is a collaboration between ourselves, the Wits Business School, our center, the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, and the Grasa Machel Trust.
When we were arranging for this dialogue and looked around for people that we could bring together to share perspectives, one of the organizations we felt was very, very critical to the discussions is an organization called the Regional Psychosocial Support Initiative. They are called REPSI for short. They agreed because they and some people on the ground were conducting psychosocial support to the victims of the cyclones. And the CEO, as well as founder of that organization, had agreed to come and be one of the panelists. Unfortunately, like Becky said, 2 days ago, we received news that she had passed on. Norinoni is her name. I would like to request all of us to stand up and observe a minute of silence in her memory.
It's really my great pleasure to join you this morning and throughout the day. In my normal life, as you might know, I'm a broadcaster, so I'm the breakfast show host for 702 Breakfast, and I'm also on a show on the SABC called The Democracy Gauge. And what a fantastic privilege, right? I'm going to be spending time with you today and really learning from all your insights in terms of how we deal with really two catastrophic events that are some of the deadliest in the Southern Hemisphere in recorded history.
My task is a simple one, primarily to say a very warm welcome to you all. And I feel fortunate for one other reason, and it is that this vision, the vision to hold this conference that we're holding here today, that Peggy's team and Belinda came up with, I think is exactly the sort of initiative, the sort of leadership that we want to be seeing, not just as a business school, but as a university, touching upon a topic that is so absolutely critical to the well-being of the people of Africa. Let me, without further ado, it is a great honor and great privilege that Mama Grasa Machel has been able to join us. Welcome her to the stage to come and address us. And from me, once again, a very warm welcome.
I want us to remember that disasters, natural disasters, have robbed us of thousands and thousands of people on this continent, but more particularly in Southern Africa, and even more particularly in the recent disasters. And those people have become statistics. They have become subject of plans of recovery, whatever you want to call it. But I just wonder, and I would like us to think about this. How many times we take a minute to pay respect to those people as human beings, as loss of human beings, which means loss of part of ourselves, which has gone forever with them. Sometimes it sounds like this tragedy having hit on us, yes, we need solidarity, but it looks like the aftermath of it, the resettlement and reconstruction it's as if it's a responsibility of international community. And we even complain that they are not doing enough. Yes, they're not doing enough. But from our side, there is a need of taking clear responsibility to say it's about the lives of our own citizens. It is about our responsibility as a nation to support and to work together with these communities for them to have a dignified restart.
Thank you, Mama Grasa Michelle. Spoken like a mother indeed, spoken from the heart.
As we are a people, we should know each other's vulnerability. And each community is vulnerable to a particular sector in a particular way. You might be in Johannesburg and you might say, oh, there's no vulnerability here. People are rich here. But they might be vulnerable to crime. You might be going to Malawi and asking yourself, what is the issue here? There's no issue here. They have got maize fields and everything. What is their vulnerability? They have a vulnerability to knowledge and social protection. Those are vulnerabilities. We have to be able to define our vulnerabilities. One of the things that, because we are undertaking a lessons learning exercise as SADC for the cyclones, Kenneth, and so forth, we are asking ourselves, what type of messaging did they receive when they were told that the cyclone is coming through? And the issue of risk perception is coming through. Oh, but Dinero came, I didn't kill anybody. It went as far as Malawi. It didn't kill anybody. We are just going to remain here. And it happened, and we were asking ourselves, but SADC sent the alerts 4 times in one day. We were sending the same alerts. It's coming, it's at level 4. It's returning from Malawi now, it's here. And they were told, stay in your houses. We are grateful for the leadership in Mozambique. We are grateful for the member states for their response, as Maggie has said, for the response shown in Kenneth. Kenneth was at the same level as Idai.
We were all home when the cyclone hit. Suddenly, the water inside our homes was at waist height, said Grasa, a Beira resident and mother of 6. Our house was made of brick, but now only rubble is left. We needed blankets, mosquito nets and support to restart. I just want a space and material to make a house for my family. An estimated 3 million people in 4 provinces in Mozambique need humanitarian assistance.
The situation in Beira, Sofala and Manica today is much worse than what we have seen in 2000. Communications are totally broken. There's no yet a thorough information of where are the people, how many people are stranded in villages, how many people are dying, how many people need really health assistance. So it's a very, very dire.
Nearly 240,000 homes are damaged or destroyed and widespread areas experienced devastation. 7 weeks after Cyclone Idai struck, nearly 68,000 people remain displaced in over 80 temporary accommodation centers.
Malawi as a country was hit in the southern districts. But you can see from the statistical point of view that 90,000 people, over 90,000 people in aggregate are displaced. There was help pouring from all over the place. And the government of Malawi, in terms of information dissemination, was very, very effective through the DODMA, which is the Department of Disaster Management, I think. Then, of course, the international community. They did a lot. There was presence of Red Cross in each and every camp you went. there was presence of gift of the givers in almost all the camps we went. They took us from one camp to the next.
In Zimbabwe, 6 districts were affected by the cyclone, but the impact was much felt in 2 districts. That is Chimanimani and Chipinge. The whole villages were just swept away. It is presumed that some people that are missing were trapped under those storms. Here we have documented the support gaps under shelter, health, agriculture, education, transport, water and sanitation, and energy in the 3 countries. But this doesn't mean that these are the only gaps that are there. There are other important gaps that are not documented here, especially on the psychosocial support. So it is important for us as Africans to talk about climate change, not only when we are here, but also in our homes, also when we are working, everywhere that we are. Let's talk about climate change. Let's act upon climate change. I thank you.
Another African tragedy. How do we even begin to at least put a human face to this tragedy?
Because people live before and after the disaster. And over the years, living in those specific cultural, ecological specific areas, they've developed knowledge systems, innovations to survive in those. So those culturally acceptable innovations, knowledge systems need to be taken into consideration in disaster preparedness. These people have developed early warning systems. They have developed agricultural ecological systems to survive in those specific ecological areas. We need to take vulnerability in terms of information. Also, the language we use also is not acceptable, is not reachable to the people. There are issues of communication also. There are issues of poverty. Also, people, they have limited resources. So they need also sometimes to gamble between preparedness of disaster and meeting the basic needs. So the human as IKS, indigenous knowledge system, have a holistic approach to disaster management, because there's life before and after.
Sometimes when you talk about disasters, it's not only about the force itself and the impact of the disaster, but also sometimes it is about human failure to implement and to make efforts and put preparedness in place. It takes the president to declare it as a state of disaster, and it got into the 2nd week before this was actually stated. We had more deaths, we had more pains, we had no people who were injured who could not get assistance. Sometimes we also look at interventions that become too militarized, commando approaches, and they do not actually take the interventions of the communities themselves and actually build the capacity for the local people to deal with interventions at local level. So by the time we get even in terms of budgets and funding that are highly centralized, budgets coming from and being declared and instructed by the president, the minister, provinces down to a district, people have suffered, and that's why even now into the 5th month of the intervention, people are still in camps, people still don't know where they're supposed to go, and people still suffer in terms of anxiety and in terms of psychosocial support.
That's quite a mouthful, because, I mean, you're really painting a picture there about, I suppose, recognizing the dignity of the people that are affected by this, and not just as helpless victims who must get bright ideas from outsiders who know better than they do. Colin Fokker, let me come to you. I mean, how do we then marry the information that comes out of institutions such as the one where we are sitting now?
I think what we're needing now is a new type of science, a science that is not just sitting at the university with forecasts and models. Although I work at the Global Change Institute and I'm a trained climate scientist, I've moved increasingly into working with small-scale farmers, people who are trying to get their agency, working with the city of Johannesburg, etc., etc. So what I'm urging, and what some of us are trying to do amongst the universities, is actually to call for 3 things. Transformation in many guises, not only politically, which is much needed, but transformation of how we do science, but that's going to require that we are transgressive. And people don't like this. You've got to shake up the institutions. So there's a lot that's going on, but it's packaged in the wrong, I think, places, and we need to start having those conversations quite seriously. But also, I think we as a community sitting here in Southern Africa need to be very careful that we don't just talk about responses. The structural controls that we're seeing daily on our televisions, the issues that are driving the vulnerabilities need to be addressed head on. The more I've worked in this field, the more I've realized that the people of Sitwetla, for example, in Alex, are going to stay vulnerable no matter what. Because, and I hate to say this, but certain corporate interests are dumping rubble. We have no rubble sites apparently available or in use in Johannesburg. Rubble is being dumped coming out of Sandton into the rivers of Alex. So you don't need a big flood. Please, let's also get away from this notion that it's a God-given crisis. It's not a God-given crisis. Climate change is for real, but it's in our capacity to think structurally and deeply. We need to have these deep conversations. So, I could do a kumbaya and say, let's go and talk to local people, but I really do think, and that's where I want to play a role as an academic, providing that agency and particularly working with the youth who, as you have seen, are mobilizing on the streets. Science is not going to be enough. So I'm sorry if I've turned it a little bit on its head, but we can forecast until we're blue in the face. We can model and say, is it 1.5, is it 2, until we're blue in the face. But until we mobilize and do this together with society, science with society, and not science for society, I think we're going to miss it completely.
Where do the two roles, in terms of what the military can do and conservation, how do those two come in? How do you want to outline it?
Yes, I'm a conservationist, but I'm also a military man. So, if I,
These two are not contradictory.
well, my job is to make sure that the destruction we wrought is done in the most environmentally friendly ways. So, but in any case, I've been able to marry these two worlds in terms of disaster management, in particularly. Conventional military forces all over the world generally have embedded logistics capability, command and control, and a disciplined workforce. We're protectors of the democracy, but democracy doesn't necessarily apply to us. We have to follow commands. The Department of Defense, in its latest defense review, indeed takes into consideration the effects of climate change. But we've combined that with various other environmental threats, including loss of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. Things like desertification and land degradation, freshwater decline, stratospheric ozone depletion. All of these threats interact with each other, and they amplify the effects of climate change or loss of biodiversity, agroecology, and this sort of thing. This all comes together, has an impact on human security, and eventually the social effects of that could lead to conflict. And that is where immediately you attract a soldier's attention. Our president was talking about it just earlier this week. He was accusing us, bureaucrats in government, of working in silos. We have a whole Department of Cooperative Governance, and part of each of our responsibilities is, of course, cooperative governance. Preparing for disaster is something we need to do within countries and between countries all the time, through all of our institutions that we have.
The kinds of events that we are describing here, just from Kenneth and Idai, are so unprecedented. How do countries even begin to insure against the kind of disasters we are seeing?
The capacity, the point I want to make is there is capacity, there is knowledge. All corporates need to have disaster management programs for them. Even mid-sized businesses now have that. So the knowledge on how to do it is there. Yes, it can be improved. Some of that knowledge is already in SADC, in the different countries in the community, so it's already in a cultural sensitive environment made applicable. Where insurance is available and accessible, it gives an opportunity for a society to weather the storm, so to speak. We buy that cover internationally. It's a risk pool transfer mechanism. And what it means at a nation level is that when a catastrophe, one of these things happen, which is billions of dollars, you effectively immediately mobilize international money into your local economy. Because when something like this happens, it devastates a local area is impacted. That local area doesn't produce, it sucks up money for relief, for rebuilding, and it takes years. And then if you don't have the access, a mechanism, an infrastructure, technology to bring money from the international world into that economy, the whole wealth of the nation is impacted for years to come. So this risk transfer, I was very, very heartened to see that presentation from the lady from SADC to say this back on the agenda, because knowing that works, it works for years, it sits behind the insurance industry all over the world, it works very, very well for all insurance companies. That is the first thing that will help in situations like this. If we have a risk pool or a risk transfer mechanism at a country level or even a regional level, when something like this happens, immediately you have cash available to start paying for all these things that needs to happen. They need to happen at once. It's not that you can prioritize what happens thereafter. And it's not new. It has been working in many places for years. California is the best one known. That state buys insurance for its people on behalf of its people. In the Caribbean countries have come together and have a risk pool for the hurricanes that move through them before it hits the United States. So those kind of risk pools have been in operation. It will be a mechanism that is reasonably easy to put into place. It's not new things we need to do, it's just the political will to prioritize. Then the third thing is, at a local level, as I said, we have something called the insurance gap or insurance protection gap. Not everyone has access to insurance, not everyone can afford insurance. In our part of the world, 95% of our people don't have the benefit of insurance. So they need to sell assets, they need to borrow, they need to rely on donations, that kind of thing. But there is something called microinsurance or microfinance. It is effectively a formalization of the informal risk transfers that exist in the different communities and in the different cultures. It's a longer term solution. That work too is on the go. It does exist. There's lots of research about it in academics. In the non-profit environments, there are some trusts. I don't know, there might be representatives in the audience of an entity called the Finmark Trust that have done some work also in our region. That gives opportunities when you implement that in countries and in society to make a society more resilient at an individual level. So this is not insurmountable. The amounts that we talk about in our part of the world are small relative to the developing world, but it will require, to the point that one of the speakers make, it will require a prioritization at the national and at the regional level to say is we want the knowledge that exists. The tools is out there, we just need to implement it. For business, the tools that sits in academics, the businesses are generally, usually good to adopt that and make it implemented practically.
Sure, there can be coordination at a local level, but even in terms of the region, is a lot of our coordination informed by the science, informed by what's likely to happen as we now start looking ahead to future cyclones?
We bandy the word around about resilience. Let's make everyone resilient. And a colleague from, in fact, an academic working in Amsterdam has actually written a paper, and it's worth reading if you can get hold of it. Do not call me resilient again. And she argues that we can have all the platforms, have all the food that we can dump everywhere. But if we're not asking the central questions as to why some people aren't getting access to food, even though the food is being driven in by a truck and placed at the end of their village road, we will constantly have issues of vulnerability. So to answer your question, I think honestly, if I may say this, and I say this fairly conservatively, we've got a lot of good science. We've got a lot of fantastic institutions in the region. But there's a problem about getting the science out there with people, getting citizen science to feed into our science. That's what we're missing.
We know that women across the board experience greater poverty, greater vulnerability, less decision-making capacity, fewer opportunities for education, fewer opportunities for economic empowerment. I thought it was interesting, there was a call to go back to traditional leadership. Well, Yeah, no. I mean, it's all good to have accountability to your community and your people, but some things need to modernize. Some things need to move with the times, and that includes involving women in that leadership. In terms of statistics, we know across the board that women tend to fare much worse and lose their lives more often than men in disasters, in humanitarian situations. And that's linked very much to this vulnerability. You saw in the film the woman who said, we were here waiting in our homes. Well, because the women stayed there to guard the homes. And we know that 20% of displaced women in general will be victims of gender-based violence requiring critical medical care. So there's all forms of gender-based violence and what we call harmful practices. And some of those in this context can also be, for example, early child marriage. A family's wiped out, they don't have the means, they can't feed a mouth. Guess what? The girl is offered up for marriage, for the lobolo, for the dowry, for something, or just because the family can no longer feed. So that is also what we consider a form of gender-based violence. It's not just physical violence.
Our reason for being is the psychosocial support that has been spoken about a couple of times earlier. When we look at a disaster, we recognize what I haven't heard here today, that what people came out of with was fear. They were afraid immediately afterwards when the rain started to fall, which you would normally welcome because you don't know what that rain is bringing with it. Is when you lose people you love, you are in grief. But we had no time to mourn. We had no time to go through the rituals that would help you to mourn and help you to come back able to begin life again. You had to just keep going without passing through those family and community times, which are so critical. And I don't think we even value that those are important. And certainly our plans for recovery don't include ceremonies for us to remember those that we have lost before we begin to move on. And those we believe are really critical and need to come in. That recovery must involve emotional healing as well as physical healing and building of buildings.
What we do is we focus on policies, food, agriculture, and natural resources policies, and so that we may become food secure, we may become nutrition secure as Africa. An African-wide mandate to ensure that we continue to produce food sustainably in the advent of climate change. It's very critical for different stakeholders to represent the vulnerable. It's also very important to have the vulnerable speak for themselves as well.
One of the issues that has been brought, of course, is how when these issues arise, the response of doctors, the medical fraternity as well, becomes a critical factor of what happens next.
People they normally speak about 3 Ps, which is your private-public partnership. But for us, we actually went for 5 Ps, which was the people, the private, the philanthropy, the public, and then the partnership. That's how it worked. So if you go into the communities in Chimanimani and Chipinge, they'll tell you that the first responder to what happened were the people helping each other, and the second thing was the army went in to look and assess the situation. The third group that went in was ourselves, Our Life Foundation, together with Connect Wise, and we took over. So I mean, I heard people speak about the government this, the government that. I heard about this framework, that framework. For us, it was not about any framework. For us, it was about these are Zimbabweans, right? We need to save lives. We're going to go in there regardless of what the government will say or will not say. Number one, we knew that Zimbabwe, at that particular point, economically things were going well. So for us to even hold back and say, let the government go in first, was not going to work for us.
As a young singer, songwriter, and also a musician that has been mentored by the great Oliver Mtukudzi, Segela, and Chaka Chaka, the first thing that I learned about music when I first met Bobo Oliver was that as Africans, music is there in times of pain, in times of joy, in times of sadness, in times of when we fight, we sing, when we cry, we sing, and when we rejoice, we sing. As a young woman, as a young Pan-African singer, what I've done in the past is always ask myself, how can I unite the community? What's happening now is that there's social media, and when a disaster strikes, it trends on social media. And it trends on that day, maybe the next, then after that, we're on to the next trend. And what that does is that there's a lot of young people, as Africans, youth is our biggest population. A lot of young people do not watch the news, they don't buy newspapers, but they are certainly on Twitter, they're on Facebook, and they're on Instagram. And what's on their lips and on their mouths is what's happening and what's trending. So as a musician, I have a role to educate the youth and to educate my society.
Food security becomes a challenge when these issues arise. It's a challenge, I suppose, even in the planning of all of this.
The emergency is what gets attention, but the devastation continues for people's lives, and I think we need to maintain the focus on rebuilding these communities. I was watching the cyclone as it evolved from a low-pressure system, flooding Mozambique, flooding parts of Malawi, and then evolved into a Category 4 storm over the Indian Ocean. And every single day I was monitoring the movements, and as it looked like it was going to impact the coast of Mozambique, we had a series of mechanisms that we could put in place to prepare ourselves. We began moving helicopters from eastern Congo, in fact, before landfall. We began triggering advanced financing mechanisms from our corporate resources before there were any donor appeals. And we began moving food from warehouses we have around Southern Africa into the theater so that we'd be able to respond. It's always a matter at the very beginning of information. You want to act, but you need to know what you're responding to. And the more we're able to use technology to access information using satellite data, we're working with the government of Mozambique to make drone technology more accessible so that we reduce the unknowns. The less you know, the less you can do. And every day that you save, every hour that you save is a life saved potentially. But right now, last week, SADC released figures for food insecurity in Southern Africa for the coming year. And we have more food insecure people in SADC than we did during El Nino. So this very panel in 2016-2017 could be gathered to discuss drought and the impact of drought, right? Now we're talking about cyclones. If we keep focusing on events without seeing the continuum of climate change and the impact that it will have on the populations of this region, I think we maybe are missing the big picture. What are the solutions? What crops will survive climate change? We already have droughts. We've only had 1 year of favorable rainfall conditions since 2012 in Southern Africa. 1 year. So drought is no longer an emergency. Drought is the new normal. Cyclones may seem an aberration, but they will also become the new normal. How are we going to adapt our diets, the way that we produce food, the way that we consume it, to be more resilient to the impact of climate change and to adapt to the monumentality of the challenge before us? I think we often forget that justice and equality will be fundamental to the promotion of the kind of societies that we will need to withstand the impact of climate change.
How do you change
the mindset of these young people who think the government owes them this, the private sector owes them this, without understanding the power of this spirit of voluntarism. I think also what Benito mentioned, the role that creatives can play, artists, musicians, actually the entire space. How do we help young people who we feel like they're left behind in terms of changing the mindset? Biko was talking about this mindset in the mind. How do we help them to change the way they think?
How do you get entitled people to become volunteers? We had a question over here.
And in Malawi, I've wondered, why is it that people always go back to the very same places where they came from? And the answers are that when the disaster strikes and everyone goes, people have no choice to go back. Now, the policy implementation, we may have policies, but how are we implementing them? So after some time, do we have really a policy that can look at maybe 2-3 years? So I suggest 2 things. One, mapping. We know where disaster strikes, especially floods. Like in Malawi, we know it's Palombe, Chikwawa, and Nsanje. We need mapping, and even in the other areas. So we should have mapping, and after mapping, we should put structures that are going to see people through 2-3 months when the excitement goes.
I think it's been very interesting to hear the voices of so many different perspectives here today. It's a constant learning experience, and I think every single year, as we proceed down this path, where we see the impacts of climate change becoming more intense, we need to continue to learn, and I think we need to treat, rather than treating every emergency as an emergency, I think we need to start treating climate change as an emergency in itself.
I definitely have a lot to think about and to share with my colleagues in the arts industry.
Fantastic. I think one of your questions was how to help people or young people who are entitled become volunteers as you conclude your remarks.
Sure. So I don't have an answer to that. In the sense that, our situation is unique. We invested the last 22 years in these young people. So we've kind of like gone back to our own, and then they've become the catalyst. They're now catalytic in the process. So it could be a question of looking for a foundation that is in South Africa that has made such investments, and then maybe looking for champions from that group, and then maybe they can then also become the catalytic, element towards, volunteerism. We've done very little so far, but starting off and getting into a group of 250,000 at least, that's a big base for us to kick off from. But Zimbabwe is a very youthful country, so we hope that 5-10 years from now, we should be getting a lot more people giving their time to volunteer. In most of people's minds, it's with the cyclone this year, it's unlikely to have another one. But I mean, we've got no control over that. So that's why we're trying to do as best as we can, and we've targeted, the 52 schools in the area that were mostly affected, and that's where the messaging and the model is being implemented, with the hope that from there, we can scale it to more disaster-prone parts of Zimbabwe.
I think there's an urgent need to come up with strategies at a regional level and local level. It will be important for us to enforce the strategies that are in place and to hold people accountable.
We all need to recognize, moving out of here, we're one world. It may have hit Chimanimani or Beira last time, but we're one world. Climate change affects us all. And until we build communities at every level that care about each other, care about our earth and our environment, and care about the future of this earth, we're not going to win.
Thank you to all our panelists, and of course to the earlier panel and all the presenters who've been part of today's dialogue. As we wrap it up then, I'm going to ask Ali Mufuruki, who's a board member of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, to come and conclude. And then, of course, Bekinkosi Moyo will come and give a vote of thanks.
My training as an engineer always has prepared me to see almost everything, including that what is not, as a problem, so that I can find a solution for it and be happy. And as you were speaking, the speakers here and the contributors, I was trying to find, so if this is the problem, and I want to make sure I understood the problem, what is the solution? The solutions were many that have been proposed. But when the solutions are many, that in itself can become a problem. So the engineer again will try to create one out of those many problems so that they can act on it, because a solution is not a solution if it cannot be actioned on. And that's why my first observation was that this discussion here would have been very effective in leading to the solution if we could separate response to disasters and saving lives and dealing with the aftermath from preparedness. It is much more important, in my view, to enable people to save their own lives, each individual life. Why? Because we will never be able to raise enough money to save all the lives that we need to save. And for every single life that you save, and I congratulate and commend all those who have been in the business of saving lives, there are 9 lives that are out of your sight that perished because you cannot see them, because they're outside your prescribed area of intervention, because nobody thought they needed to be saved. But if we can empower people with the knowledge to save themselves, with the tools they need to be able to save themselves, and communities to be able to organize, to be ready to talk on radio and in schools about the seasons, about kids. If kids go home every day and tell their parents, cyclones are going to start hitting us in a month, teachers are saying that. Maybe it will change our behavior. Maybe it will change the way we look at these things. So I think that this kind of preparation, resilience, use of knowledge, of history, or what they called indigenous knowledge systems, infused with some modern knowledge of forecasting and government planning on how, when it strikes, because they know the magnitude, they know the kind of damage it's going to do, they know how they can protect the bridges or they cannot protect the bridges, how they are going to find alternative ways of moving people, where they are going to move people, where they are going to move livestock, how they are going to care for property. So these things, where I come from, we never discuss them. They are not part of governments. It's like some kind of secret. There is an office somewhere called Disaster Preparedness and Relief. And from time to time, business people like myself are hit on to give some money to this fund, especially now as the election season comes. But it's never enough. It doesn't matter how much money you give. The disasters are always 100 times bigger. So we are impotent when they strike. So I'd like us to look at solutions when people are writing the reports on how we can provide, create robust systems for preparedness that are actionable at community level, at family level, at school level, at business level, before we even worry about national level, because people have to save their lives. Thank you very much.
So I just want to start by apologizing in advance in the event I forget somebody. Everyone is appreciated and thanked very much for making the time for today. I also want to thank WBS and its leadership for lending the support to this important event. And in particular, I really am blessed because I work with somebody who is super efficient. I want to thank Belinda, that all of you have been communicating. But I wanted to use this opportunity to thank all of you for coming on a Friday and staying till this late. We know that the program was really packed. We wanted to begin the conversation And out of this, we are going to do the report. We are also going to produce a short video that summarizes some of the key issues that we discussed here. And then the partners that put this together will obviously get back together and begin to identify some of the issues that we can start implementing.